Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 877 for June 28, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
You can gently downregulate your PFC, get the mood boost, get some added creativity, and then 2 hours later, you're fine because it's been eliminated from your body. So it really is, if you asked a team of cultural engineers to come up with a substance, you gave them a checklist of functions you wanted, they would come up with something very much like alcohol.
Why do we choose to drink? Not each of us individually, but as Homo sapiens, the species that occupies the top spot on the world's food chain, at least most of the time. That's the question University of British Columbia professor Edward Slingerland looks at in his new book, Drunk: How We Slipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. For instance, there are people who have a genetic mutation that makes them violently ill when they drink. But if alcohol is bad for us, why isn't that mutation found more widely throughout the world's population? Could it be that evolution recognizes the benefits of drinking in moderation? I'll talk with Edward Slingerland later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also find out what his preferred choice of neurotoxin, whiskey, is. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and...
The cow horn is the receptacle. Obviously, it's calcium. You put sort of manure in there and you bury it underground, and it ferments. So you don't just get manure, you get a fermented calcium-enriched manure, which is super strong.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. Robin Redbreast? You may have seen me around. Face label, label face. Yeah, that's the one. I'm now contractually obligated to be their spokesbird. Yeah, my agent didn't read the small print. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Hey, Gabriel Cardarella here from Dewar's Blended Scotch Whisky. I'm excited to share with you that Dewar's is the most awarded blended Scotch whisky in the world. And that's worth raising a glass to. So grab a bottle today and enjoy this week's episode of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. This month's deals between the U.S., the European Union, and Great Britain to suspend all of their tariffs on whiskeys and other distilled spirits for at least 5 years still leaves American bourbon makers in the lurch. That's because the trade deals only covered a long-standing dispute over subsidies to aircraft makers Airbus and Boeing, and not the fight over steel and aluminum tariffs that led Europe to retaliate with tariffs on bourbon and other American whiskeys back in 2018. While British officials have started a consultation process aimed at restructuring the tariffs they inherited from Europe after Brexit, a new group has formed in the UK to put more pressure on International Trade Secretary Liz Truss to eliminate the whiskey tariff. The Bourbon Alliance already has widespread support from within the whiskey industry, as well as consumer groups like the British Bourbon Society. Martha Dalton of Never Say Die Bourbon is the group's founder.
We've got about 45 members that span across the big brands, so Jim Beam and Maker's Mark, Brown-Forman are on board, emerging brands like mine, Never Say Die, but then also we've teamed up with the hospitality industry, so lots of pubs, bars, restaurants, and then also retailers, importers, distributors. So basically it's a team effort to try and get the tariff scrapped.
In our coverage of the tariffs on American whiskeys in the UK and Europe, we've focused a lot on the U.S. makers of bourbon and the exporters. But give me a sense of what it has done to the industry within the UK and Europe, and especially to the consumers.
Sure. So obviously it's a tariff that we feel has been really unfairly put on us. You know, it's a trade dispute that's nothing to do with bourbon whatsoever. So far, we believe UK consumers have paid £55 million in tariffs. They've really been footing the bill for the rest of Europe as well. So UK consumers have paid almost 25% of the tariff. And we know that imports are down 53% as well. And as you can imagine, you know, during COVID times, the hospitality industry has had just a completely devastating year. And this is just another thing that is really, you know, pushing down their profits and reducing jobs in the sector. So we're really keen to get the tariff scrapped as soon as possible.
I know that Liz Truss has started the consultation process towards revising the tariff scheme. Are you confident at all that the British government's going to actually remove the tariff on bourbon, or is this just to put more pressure on them to actually do it?
So we're really pleased that the Airbus-Boeing dispute was settled last week and the tariffs on Scotch were removed. We think that's, you know, a good first step. And it also serves to show how unfair the bourbon tariff is. So, you know, we're confident that the UK government is going to do the right thing because it's the right thing for the UK, which we think is, you know, obviously, you know, the most important thing here.
Explain why your rationale for saying that the British consumers are the ones paying, are basically subsidizing the rest of Europe on this. I know that the UK imported more bourbon before the tariffs than the rest of Europe. Is that the case? Or explain why you say this.
Yeah, so I think basically we have the largest, we're the largest fans of bourbon in the UK, you know, compared to the rest of Europe. And so it's really been UK consumers that have been footing the bill. And £55 million is, you know, is a lot of money. So we think that the tariffs can't be scrapped soon enough.
As a producer of bourbon and an importer of bourbon, what's this meant to you in terms of trying to get your brand off the ground?
Well, we basically have hundreds of barrels of delicious bourbon in Kentucky that we haven't been able to ship to the UK. So it's stalled the launch of our brand. So it's had, you know, very significant business impacts for us. Obviously, you know, we're lucky that bourbon only gets more delicious. So it's not the end of the world. But, you know, we were really keen to launch this autumn and we're not going to be able to do that because of the tariff.
Unless it's removed quickly, right?
Exactly. The consultation finishes at the start of July. And then, you know, we don't know how long it's going to take for the government to, you know, look through all of the consultation responses. We think that it's a no-brainer to scrap this tariff, so we hope it's a really swift decision.
Dalton's own Never Say Die bourbon brand is being produced in collaboration with Wilderness Trail Distillery in Kentucky, which is also a member of the Alliance. Other members include Kentucky Peerless Distilling, Uncle Nearest, Few Spirits, Catoctin Creek, New Riff Distilling, and the Whiskey Exchange. In Scotland, construction work has been delayed on the new Wolfcraig distillery to be built near Stirling. That's because the project is being moved to a new site. Wolfcraig's founders announced a deal this week to relocate the distillery site to Ambassador Group's new Craigforth campus development. It'll be part of a mixed-use development on the site of Prudential Insurance's former UK headquarters and will include hotels, retail, office space, and housing, along with a distillery. According to Wolfcraig consultant Ian McMillan, the new site has a better water supply and will be more visible to motorists along the M9 motorway. Construction is expected to begin once Stirling Council grants planning approval, with a goal of breaking ground by the end of this year or in early 2022. Lindoris Abbey distillery founders Drew and Helen Mackenzie Smith are about to release the first publicly available whiskey from the historic Abbey in more than 500 years. This Friday, the first Lindoris Abbey 1494 single malt will reach retailers. Of course, 1494 was when the Abbey's Friar John Core was recorded in royal records as being taxed on 8 bowls of malt to make aqua vitae for the king. It's the oldest known written reference to whiskey making in Scotland. And as Drew Mackenzie Smith told us back in January on our Happy Hour live webcast, that history brings a lot of responsibility with it.
One of the things that was an option in a funny way was, hey, what a great story. Make it a Disneyland for whiskey. You know, we have William Wallace, we have all these different things. You could just always rely on the history and forget the spirit. My belief from day one was if you're going to build a whiskey distillery, it lives or dies by the whiskey. So there is a pressure, and a promise I made with Jim Swan, 15 odd years ago, and lots of people I met along the way, was that there was that shoulder that only happened by luck, if you like. And my grandfather bought the farm in 1913. We had no idea of any whiskey links or anything like that. And then 20 years ago, we suddenly find we do have this weight of pressure. But you've got to enjoy a challenge. But I suppose it was Jim Swan in discussion one day was saying that you've got to remember that in whiskey tastings, wherever they are, whether in America or London or Fife, they're blind tastings. So it doesn't, he was kind of joking in a way, but, Friar John Cork will be sitting in the corner of the room, and that makes no difference. The spirit from Lindoris has to stand up.
There will be 2 labels for the initial release, the main Lindoris Single Malt 1494 and a commemorative one-time-only label. By the way, the 1494 is in Roman numerals. To be specific, MCDXCIV, just in case you've forgotten Roman numerals from grade school. Technically, it's the second single malt release from the distillery. 1,494 bottles were made available last year to members of the Lindoris Abbey 1494 Society. Meanwhile, the Glasgow Distillery Company has released a new version of its triple-distilled 1770 single malt. This release is matured in a combination of ex-bourbon and virgin oak casks, while the debut release used virgin oak exclusively. It's available through the distillery's website. And Douglas Lang & Company is out with 2 new port cask finished versions of its Epicurean Lowland blended malt. One is finished in a single ruby port cask and the other in a single tawny port cask. Both will be available in limited quantities for around £60 each. Ireland's Waterford Distillery is expanding on founder Mark Rainier's history in the wine business. It'll be bottling Luna, what the distillery claims is the world's first biodynamic whiskey, this summer. Biodynamics is popular among a growing number of winemakers. It's based on the 1924 writings of Austrian Rudolf Steiner, advocating a return to traditional farming practices at a time when the chemical industry was promoting the increased use of pesticides and fertilizers. At its core, biodynamics is, and this is a bit of a contradiction in terms, organic farming on steroids. It includes things like planting seeds based on lunar cycles, fertilizing fields using cow horns filled with manure, and limiting the use of machinery in the fields. Back in 2018, I talked with Mark Rainier shortly after the barley for Luna was planted.
The core principle is that a farm has to be self-sufficient, because it always was. Fred Flintstone didn't nip down to Costco to buy stuff. They had to do what was there. And so it's sort of a way of life. It's not something you just do. It's, you have to run your whole farm or your whole estate according to that premise. And so the fertilizers and the soils, it's all about having a living soil, because of course, you add all these, years and years of insecticides and pesticides. You're basically neutering the soil. You're killing the soil to the extent that eventually the soil only does whatever you put on it and nothing else. So biodynamics is very much about a living soil. The soil has to be living. It has to be nutritious. It has to be composted, manured. It has to be living. And then from that, everything else stems.
You can listen to the entire interview with Mark Rainier in episode 685 of WhiskyCast from March 2018. It's in the archives at whiskycast.com. Back then, he was able to convince 3 of the Irish barley growers he's working with to convert their fields to biodynamic agriculture. Luna comes from those crops and will be available globally later this summer. There's no word yet on pricing. Michter's will only have 1 batch of its 10-year-old single-barrel rye available this year. It'll be shipping out of Kentucky to retailers next month. The recommended retail price is $170 a bottle. Membership in the Scotch Malt Whisky Society does not include an ownership stake. That costs extra. But for the first time, it's actually possible. That's because the Artisanal Spirits Company, which owns the SMWS, has started trading shares publicly for the first time on the London Stock Exchange's AIM market. Artisanal Spirits had been a privately held firm until now. It was created in 2015 when investors acquired the society from the Glenmorangie Company. The initial public offering at £1.12 per share valued the company at £78 million. Company executives plan to use the proceeds from the IPO to invest in whiskey and spirits stock, its existing venues in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and London, and potential new venues in other cities. John Ray is back in the bourbon business. He is coming out of retirement to join Stoli Group as the master blender for Kentucky Owl's whiskeys. Ray spent years at Four Roses and was the distillery's chief operating officer when he retired, as well as a member of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. He takes over for Kentucky Owl founder Dixon Dedman, who parted ways with Stoli Group earlier this spring. And speaking of bourbon, while the 2013 Pappygate scandal has largely faded into memory, the story behind the theft of thousands of dollars worth of Pappy Van Winkle whiskeys from a Buffalo Trace warehouse is coming to a screen near you. It'll be featured in the upcoming season of the Netflix series Heist and includes a rare interview with Gilbert Toby Kurtzinger. He's the former Buffalo Trace warehouse worker and ringleader of the gang that was responsible for stealing around 65 cases of whiskey and selling some of it at area softball games. Kurtzinger was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but wound up being released after 30 days in Kentucky's shock probation program. The second season of Heist drops on Netflix July 14th. On that note, Police Scotland is looking for help in solving another break-in at the Tullibardine Distillery's Visitors Center. The Scotsman reports that Thursday night, someone broke through the doors and walked away with 8 vintage bottles of whiskey, 4 bottles of 1964 Custodian Scotch whisky valued at £2,000 each, and 4 bottles of the Highland Queen 46-year-old blended Scotch. They were worth £600 each. The distillery is located just off the A9 highway, which makes it easy for someone to get away. Back in 2016, a similar overnight break-in resulted in the loss of 7 bottles of whiskey valued at £14,000, along with 2 glasses. This time around, the thieves presumably did not need the glassware. Finally, the Monroe family has had a place at the Glenlivet for decades. Eric Monroe worked in the distillery, while Betty was the longtime Visitors Center manager. Betty Monroe died this past Thursday after a brief illness. Our condolences go out to Eric, their children Vivian, Gary, and Jenny, and all of her friends in Scotland. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. Don't forget to join us Friday night for our next Happy Hour live webcast. We'll start at 5 p.m. New York time, 10 p.m. London time, and 2100 GMT on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel, our Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. If you missed last Friday night's webcast with Louise McGuane of Ireland's J.J. Corey Irish Whiskey and Alistair Day of Isle of Rassay Distillery, the on-demand replay is available right now at our YouTube channel. Wait for the podcast to end, though, first, okay? Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. More good news this week on the pandemic front. Got word from the folks at Maltstock in the Netherlands that they will be able to go ahead with this year's event on the weekend of September 10th through the 12th. Everyone attending will either have to be fully vaccinated or test negative for COVID first. Canada Day is this coming Thursday, but the Kensington Wine Market in Calgary, Alberta has 2 virtual Canada Day tastings this week, on Tuesday with British Columbia's Shelter Point Distillery, and Wednesday with the guys from 2 brewers in Whitehorse, Yukon. Hard Truth Distilling's Indiana Rye release party is this Saturday in Nashville, Indiana. Castle and Key Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky has its monthly Springhouse Music Series night on July 7th. John Distillery's founder Paul John is the guest of honor at a spirited supper July 8th in Los Angeles. It is sponsored by the Center for Culinary Culture. The Whiskey Rebellion Festival is July 10th in Washington, Pennsylvania, and Whiskey Live Brisbane is on the 16th and 17th in Brisbane, Australia. Right now, we have 181 different live and virtual events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the Where to Buy page at catoctincreekdistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
After 175 years, Dewar's has learned it's not all about awards. Staying Curious happened to help us fill that trophy case with more than just our amateur fishing, golf, and bowling trophies. It takes time and commitment to make some of the world's most awarded whiskey, which is why every Dewar's whiskey goes through a secondary resting period for a more balanced blend with extra smoothness. From our first master blender, A.J. Cameron, to our current Stephanie McLeod, we've honed our double aging process to make some of the world's best Scotch whiskies. Dewar's 12 Year, for example, was just awarded the double gold at this year's World Spirits Competition in San Francisco. And Dewar's 27 Year took home Best Blended Scotch Whiskey 16 years or older. No need to take our word for it. Pick up one of these great whiskeys today. Your palate won't be disappointed.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Oban and the Classic Malts lineup. Why do we drink whiskey and other alcoholic beverages? Certainly, there is a basic understanding that drinking too much whiskey, or any other alcoholic beverage, isn't good for us, both short-term and long-term. Still, pun intended, people have been drinking pretty much since the first cave dwellers found out what happens when fruit ferments. And pretty much every attempt to ban alcohol ever since has been doomed to failure. There is a lot to be said for drinking in moderation, and as we've encouraged since the beginning of WhiskyCast, drinking responsibly. Edward Slingerland is a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. The New Jersey native is also the co-director of the university's Center for the Study of Human Evolution, Cognition, and Culture. He's been studying the question of why we drink, and his new book, Drunk, How We Slipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization, makes the case that without fermentation, we wouldn't have had civilization. We talked about the book over Zoom the other day. What prompted you to write the book, first of all, and to do the research into why we as Homo sapiens drink.
The standard story is that we drink because it's an accident. So the standard scientific story is that alcohol's picking a lock in our brains. It's allowing us to trigger this reward circuit that evolved for other reasons. And it's just an accident that that's the case. And I just thought that couldn't possibly be right, because alcohol is so costly. It's really dangerous substance, right? It's physiologically dangerous. It raises cancer risk. It hurts our livers. If there's probably about 15% of the human population is prone to alcoholism. And if you are prone to alcoholism, you can't use alcohol safely. And we have, accounts from ancient China to ancient Egypt of the horrors of alcoholism, the cost it imposes on individuals, families, and their communities. And so it just seemed to me impossible that evolution would allow our taste for alcohol to continue given the costs involved. And so there had to be something else going on. There had to be some sort of functional benefits on the other side.
And there really are in many ways in terms of the social construct that we have. But it's also that pretty much, as you note in the book, most mammals have some form of altering their minds in some way or consuming something that sends them into what we would call an intoxicated state, right?
Yeah, so we're not the only animal that likes to get intoxicated. The organized way in which we go about it and the emphasis that we put upon getting intoxicated is really unusual. And for very good reason. We're an unusual species. And so my argument is that alcohol has certain effects that help us to better adapt to this weird ecological niche that we live in. So if you look at the scientific literature, if you look at the usages of alcohol historically, it's ramping up creativity. It helps us to think outside the box and engage in lateral thinking more easily. It lowers inhibitions, which allows us to share information and learn information better. It makes us like other people more. It makes us like ourselves more, and it makes us like other people more. It makes it harder to lie or cheat. And so it has this kind of trust enhancing function that in social situations. And so it's doing a lot of work that is really focused on helping us. We're primates, but the way in which we've lived since we've had agriculture looks a lot more like social insects, like ants or bees. We cooperate on this massive scale and cooperate really closely in ways that's unusual for a primate. So my argument is alcohol's been one of the cultural tools that we use to help us do that.
As we cope with life here on God's Big Ant Farm, explain the meaning behind the hijack and hangover theories that you start off with in the book and trying to explain those, because you use hangover in a different term than I think most of us would.
Yeah, I'm using it a bit as a pun. But yeah, so the hijack theory is the dominant one, and it's the one that I described earlier. So alcohol is just hijacking reward circuits that evolve for other reasons. And in that regard, it's similar to masturbation or non-reproductive sex. So evolution gives us this really awesome reward, the orgasm, for doing the thing that's most centrally related to what it wants us to do, which is pass on our genes. The fact that we can get that reward, we figured out ways to get that reward in ways that are not reproductive, doesn't really bother evolution that much because it still works pretty well. Again, that the argument is that can't be the case because of how costly alcohol is. So the hijack, the simple hijack theory doesn't make sense. The hangover theories are an evolutionary hangover or a mismatch is the idea that something could be adaptive earlier in our evolutionary history, but then become maladaptive now. And so the classic example of a hangover is our taste for fat and sugar. So we've evolved this, we love fat and sugar. We get a lot of pleasure we get reward circuits firing when we consume these in large quantities. This made sense for most of our evolutionary history, where getting enough fat and sugar was a challenge. And so if you found it, you should eat as much of it as you could right away. For people living in South Jersey, let's say, with access to, 7-Elevens and Twinkies and all sorts of junk food, it's maladaptive. But it's something that's become maladaptive very recently. This has only really happened the past 100 years or so. And it's still not universal. So there are still parts of the world where getting enough calories is actually a challenge, where people are hungry, and this drive to eat sugar and fat is still quite adaptive. So that's an example of a hangover. And again, it doesn't work for alcohol, because alcohol is something we've been using for so long that it had to have been adaptive earlier and has to still be adaptive now. And it's also the case that most of the hangover stories about alcohol don't make sense because we have other ways to do the same function. So I think that the dominant one is the dirty water theory. So when you take contaminated water and you ferment it, it often gets purified. So if you drink beer made from dirty water, it's often okay to drink. The problem with that idea that we developed fermentation to purify our water is that you could also just boil it, which is a lot easier than going through this whole fermentation thing, and gives you nice, healthy boiled water instead of this neurotoxin. So I review, but also then dismiss most of these hangover theories.
That brings me to the point you talk about the dirty water theory, and a lot of folks would say that, well, yeah, we basically survived by turning stuff into alcohol because we didn't have water purification. And we now have that to this day. But to go back to the genetic part for a second, evolution did make some people allergic to alcohol, but genetically. But if it were that bad for us, why didn't that genetic mutation spread throughout society?
So that's, for me, the kind of fatal argument against hijack or hangover. So it's possible that alcohol is really bad for us. It's just parasitizing our brain, and evolution just hasn't figured out a way to fix it. And that's possible. Selection can't work on variation that doesn't exist. And so that's why I look at that gene complex. So there is this gene complex that is sometimes called the Asian flushing syndrome. It's actually two separate mutations, but it interferes with your ability to metabolize alcohol in such a way that when you drink even a small amount of alcohol, you flush, you have heart palpitations, you feel nauseous. So the central question driving this is, why do we like to get drunk? And the shallow answer is because it makes us feel good. And it's a shallow answer because it doesn't need to make us feel good. Really, the deeper question is, why has evolution allowed it to make us feel good? And that's especially puzzling given the existence of people who it makes feel bad. And these people, when they drink, feel bad. And it's so effective at removing the taste of alcohol from an individual that a chemical that reproduces the effects of it is used to treat alcoholism quite effectively. And so if alcohol is a parasite, if it's a mistake, this mistake was solved probably 10,000 years ago, so 7,000 to 10,000 years ago in East Asia. And yet this gene complex has not moved very much since then. So it started in what's now Southeast China, and it's gone a little bit inland. It's gone to Japan and Korea in small amounts, but it stayed pretty much put. And it also evolved independently in parts of Europe and the Mideast at least twice, and also remained very geographically constrained. And so this is puzzling. When genetic evolution figures out a solution to a problem that's really useful, it shares it immediately everywhere it's useful. And yet this gene complex didn't spread. So that suggests to me that there's countervailing benefits to having an intact taste for alcohol that keep the taste for alcohol in our gene pool.
Let's talk about those now, because people who've listened to the first part of this interview will think, well, we're bashing on alcohol, but we're not really, because used properly, used responsibly, it can actually enhance one's life and one's creativity and one's social construct.
Right. Yeah. So creativity, one of the other motivations, kind of the insights that made me think, oh, this would be an interesting topic to write about, was a talk I gave a few years ago to Google Campus, where I mentioned in passing, I was talking about my previous work on spontaneity and creativity and trust. Trying Not to Try is my trade book from a few years back. And in passing, I mentioned a study that looked at alcohol and creativity. So they brought people to about 0.08 blood alcohol content, and they did better on these creativity tasks than sober controls did. And when Q&A started, someone shot their hand up and said, "Hey, have you ever heard of the Balmer Peak?" And this is supposedly, so they explained it to me, I hadn't heard of it, this idea that Steve Ballmer, the former CEO of Microsoft, discovered that his coding ability peaked at this very narrow blood alcohol content. So he's not good. Then suddenly it got really, really good, and then it goes down if you drink too much. And supposedly kept himself hooked up to an IV of alcohol that would keep him right at that BAC. And it sounds like it's probably apocryphal, but it gets at this idea that alcohol at the right level of inebriation, you're more creative. You come up with new ideas. And then after the talk, they were going to take me on a campus tour, and they said, "Well, we know where we're taking you first." And they took me to a room that looks very much like your studio. It was this room, the whiskey room, they called it, that was lined with I love single malt scotches, the most beautiful single malt scotches I've ever seen in my life. I was so jealous. And they said when they run into a barrier in their work, when they're trying to work at a problem, they can't figure it out, they're banging their head against the wall, they stop and they go to the whiskey room and they pour themselves a little bit of scotch and they sit in beanbag chairs and they just talk. And often that relaxing of the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that is goal-directed and keeps you focused on task, relaxing that control can be really helpful. And they said they often had insights when they did this. So the fact that a really successful organization like Google is using Scotch or whiskey in an instrumental way to help enhance innovation and creativity, to me, was very revealing.
You mentioned the prefrontal cortex. It often seems to me that when we're stuck on something, it's because we're overthinking it and we're letting our brain get in the way. And that's the prefrontal cortex doing that, right?
Yeah, that's the end. The prefrontal cortex is great. We need it to stay focused. We need it to get up in the morning and know what we're going to do. We need it to control impulses and delay gratification and plan for the future and override tendencies that are negative that we need to fix. But it's definitely the enemy of creativity. And we have good data on this. So I look at Alison Gopnik's work. She's a psychologist at UC Berkeley and has shown that kids are really good at creativity tasks. 4-year-olds are great at these tasks, and we get worse as we age. And in the book, I lay that next to a graph showing our prefrontal cortex maturing, and it's the same line. So as our prefrontal cortex gets stronger, we become less creative, less able to think outside the box. We also become less trusting. So we're less able to trust other people. We're less able to learn to take in novel information. And so, evolution has this problem. So it wants us to have a prefrontal cortex because we need it to be useful adults in society. It also interferes with these desirable features. And so the solution, Gopnik argues that this is the reason that the PFC takes so long to develop. It's the last part of the brain to mature. It doesn't mature until you're like 24 or 25. And so evolution's solution is to take its time, to give us a really long childhood where we have an underdeveloped PFC so we can learn all the skills we need to learn and trust other people and get acculturated into the culture that we live in. But what I'm arguing in the book is, if you want to think about that, it'd be nice if you could get adults back into that state temporarily. And alcohol is one of the technologies that we've invented to do that. So one function of alcohol is to take our PFC offline for a short period of time and return us in some ways to the state of being a 4-year-old. And that's recapturing the child's mind can be useful.
That could also be dangerous too, though. But I say that just facetiously almost, because I'm not sure we really always want to act like 4-year-olds after having
no,
a
and
few
we don't
drinks,
want we don't want 4-year-olds driving cars, right, or running things really. So yeah, that's the danger, right? We don't, and that's the danger of alcohol. That's why it's got to be used in this responsible fashion, where you're also doing some planning around it, so that you're that 4-year-old mind you've been shoved into is not going to get you in trouble or cause trouble for other people.
How does alcohol compare to other drugs, though, and other intoxicants? Because we have no shortage of ways to shut the prefrontal cortex down or sledgehammer it into submission in some ways. But how does alcohol compare to the other substances we like to, or some of us like to partake in?
It's similar in a lot of ways. And what these intoxicants all have in common is, as you say, kind of sledgehammering or PFC. And also, like alcohol, raising our mood. They're often boosting endorphins, serotonins. So I call alcohol the king of intoxicants. It's by far the most widely used intoxicant. You find it everywhere. In cultures that have multiple intoxicants, it's still the most important one. It's the one that's used socially at public functions. And that's because other intoxicants have problems. So cannabis, for instance, is great in some ways. So it's not, unlike alcohol, it's not addictive physiologically. So it can be psychologically addictive, but not physically. Like alcohol is like cocaine or heroin. You can get really physically addicted to alcohol. And it's probably better for your body than alcohol is overall. But cannabis has really variable effects on people. So its cognitive effects vary from individual to individual. So, I mean, for instance, after I left New Jersey, I spent all of my adult life in San Francisco or LA or Vancouver, there's a lot of cannabis floating around. It makes me feel, if I smoke cannabis, I feel really dumb and paranoid, and then I fall asleep. And so it's not really a useful drug for me socially. Whereas I have friends in grad school and who I worked with, whom it made energetic and social, and they wanted to dance and chat. So cannabis is so variable that it's not a useful social drug. It has two variable effects on people. And it's also hard to dose. So you can't, if you're smoking it, you need to be able to hold it in your lungs the right amount of time. If you're using it in edible form, it has really varying effects. And very long delayed effects. So it's very hard to dose. So it's just not an ideal drug in that regard. Psychedelics, which have some similar effects, dissociate us from reality so much that they're also not useful for most functions. So you're never going to have people meeting after work to chat about, what should we do in our next project and drop acid, right? It's just the conversation is not going to go well. And they're not going to be able to function again until the next day. And so alcohol is easy to make. It's easy to dose. If you know the strength of what you're drinking, you know exactly how to dose it. It has very similar effects on people across individuals. It also has a short function time. So we have this dedicated machinery that is waiting for alcohol to come, and it starts breaking it down and getting it out of us right away. And so you can gently downregulate your PFC, get the mood boost, get some added creativity, and then 2 hours later, you're fine because it's been eliminated from your body. So it really is, if you asked a team of cultural engineers to come up with a substance, you gave them a checklist of functions you wanted, they would come up with something very much like alcohol. Well,
they would talk to the accountants who would come up with vodka because it takes whiskey too long to mature and it would be too expensive.
Right, exactly. So. Yeah. Well, they would come up with is beers and wines. And so that's another issue is that alcohol has, so I'm arguing in the book, it's had these important functions over the course of our history. But for most of that history, we've been drinking beers and wines, and they've been pretty weak. So beers clocking in at 2%, 3% ABV. Fruit wines coming in maybe 7, 8, 9%. Because before we had modern yeast, we really couldn't get, it's modern yeast that allow us to get these really strong beers or get these Aussie Shiraz up to like 16, 17% ABV. But, alcohol has always come with this built-in safety feature, which is that natural fermentation can only get you so far. the yeast are converting sugar into alcohol. They're slowly poisoning themselves, right? But they do it because they poison the bacteria first, and that's all they care about. But at a certain point, they shut down because the alcohol is poisoning them. The way around that is distillation. And what people don't realize is how relatively recent distillation is. It's an easy concept, right? You heat up the mixture of water and alcohol boils off first, capture the vapor, turn it back into a liquid. You've got something like in the 90s ABV. The problem is that technologically it's really challenging to do. You need to master a bunch of different technologies like metallurgy and glass blowing. You need to be able to keep a mixture at a very constant temperature for a long time. You need to be able to handle liquids and gases under pressure. And so it's actually really challenging to do in practice. And so it really wasn't, you didn't have widespread availability of distilled liquors in Europe until the 1700s, which on the time scale of the story that I'm telling is yesterday. It's really recent development. So it's possible that distilled liquors are actually not what we adapted to and maybe more dangerous than we're capable of handling. So, I mean, one takeaway I've had from researching the book has been treating my single malt consumption with more caution, because it is distilled liquors are really they're so much stronger than beers and wines that they almost should be considered a different drug, because it's very hard to drink to the point of blacking out or dying on a 2% beer. You just physically can't get the volume into your stomach. It's very easy to do with Scotch or vodka or rum. So they're distilled liquors are dangerous substances.
Let's talk about the connection between alcohol and religion, because it could be said that there are a number of religions and cultures that oppose the use of alcohol. But then again, if you look at how it was treated back in the days of the Bible, I'm probably going to catch hell for saying this, but if Moses is seeing the burning bush, I wonder what he'd had before he saw the burning bush.
Yeah, right.
And whether he was completely lit up when he went up the mountain. Right.
No, I mean, religions use intoxicants constantly. Christianity has this very intimate relationship with wine, right? It's at the center of the Eucharist. As I point out in the conclusion to the book, my partner pointed this out to me. I hadn't thought about this. She asked me, what's the first miracle that Jesus performed? What do you think? And I was like, raising Lazarus from the dead? No. Loaves and fishes, walking on water? No. It's turning water into wine, right? He's at this wedding with his mom and the disciples, and they run out of wine. It's like it's a disaster. His mom's like, hey, Jesus, do something about this. And he's pressured into performing his first miracle because you can't have a wedding without wine. And so, it's really at the center of human sociality and religiosity. It's typically a sacred substance. It's often considered special to the gods. It's what you sacrifice to your ancestors. In cultures where you make sacrifices to your ancestors, you sacrifice valuable food and you sacrifice alcohol. You don't sacrifice yogurt drinks or water, right? Even though presumably they might be thirsty. There's something special about alcohol, and it's because of the psychoactive properties that it's been at the center of most world religions.
Where do we go from here? What should we take from this as the takeaway to help us guide ourselves in the future? Because we see governments starting to return to almost a prohibitionist mentality in some ways, especially during the pandemic. Coming out of the pandemic, where we're seeing drinking levels just go off the charts as people self-medicate at home. What should we take from this going forward?
One of the motivations for writing the book was to help public policy makers think more intelligently about alcohol. So right now, we think of it purely in medical physiological terms. And if you think about alcohol purely in medical physiological terms, you shouldn't drink it. The net effects are negative. You can talk about the cholesterol and the French paradox all you want. The net effects physiologically of alcohol are negative. But if you then talk about the functional benefits, the way it helps with creativity and innovation, the way it helps people bond, the way it helps people solve cooperation problems, those have to go in the positive side of the equation. It could be the case that the answer is still no. So it could be that even after you weigh all the positive functions of alcohol, you decide that, you want limits on it, or it's too dangerous to use in your company's, retreats, or you don't want it in academia. That's an intelligent, defensible position, but it has to be made in a context where you're taking all the factors into consideration. And I just think right now our public conversations around intoxicants are uninformed. We're kind of flying blind because we don't know anything about the history, anthropology, the evolutionary dynamics of intoxicant use. And so that's one of what the things I want to do is change public debate about this and realize that, if you get rid of alcohol, let's say you don't allow alcohol at your company functions anymore, you're going to save drunk driving, you're going to save lawsuits, you're going to cut down on sexual harassment. There's all these costs you will mitigate, but you're losing stuff. You're losing creativity, you're losing bonding, you're losing important things. And you still may end up saying, you know what, it's okay because the costs are too high, but at least you'll have made an intelligent decision instead of one made out of ignorance. And so I think we need to have the public discussion of intoxicant use needs to change.
The one final point you list among all of the negatives of alcohol, early in the book you start going through all these negatives and then you go, and of course it leads to karaoke.
Yes, that's the worst. It's the absolute worst. Yeah, we definitely need to eliminate karaoke, but everything else we could probably keep dancing and singing and all the things that alcohol enhances and brings into our lives. So, be aware of the dangers. Be aware of the fact that for all of our history, alcohol has been a social drug. It's something we've consumed in groups in a communal setting where there are ritual regulations about how much you can drink and when you can drink. Private access to alcohol has been very rare in our history. And yet now, you can sit in your home surrounded by bottles of scotch. You have enough alcohol behind you to kill an entire small island full of people. And you have private access to that. And so that's a new thing. And so just being aware of the fact that alcohol is more dangerous now. We have private access to it. We drink alone more, which is not healthy. And we're often drinking these really powerful distilled liquors. So I think as long as we're also cognizant of the novel dangers that alcohol presents, we can also, as individuals, make better choices about how to incorporate it into our lives.
Would it be fair to say we need to engage the prefrontal cortex before we neutralize it and just make some decisions ahead of time?
That's a good strategy, yeah. Help us help ourselves by letting your prefrontal cortex set some ground rules first. And we do this, right? We line up a designated driver. We make a decision before we go out that we won't have more than 2 drinks or whatever. So we can do that. We can have our prefrontal cortex have it say before we send it out of the room about what the ground rules are.
You mentioned you like single malts. What are you drinking these days?
The problem is I live in Canada and it's possible to get good single malt here because they're so expensive. So my Lagavulin 16-year-old is my kind of standard go-to. And I can get that at K&L Wines in San Francisco, usually for like $70. Here it's like $250. So I just can't afford to drink it here. Yeah. So I don't drink as much single malt Scotch being in Canada. I tend to drink less here because the quality of the alcohol that I can afford is less. And I save myself for when I go to the States and I can actually get, a really good Scotch or a really good wine for a reasonable price. But I'm a wine drinker. And then like a single malt Scotch after dinner is my preferred drinking progression.
Edward Slingerland is a professor at the University of British Columbia and the author of the new book, Drunk, How We Slipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. If your local bookstore doesn't have it, we've posted an Amazon link in the show notes for this episode at the WhiskyCast website. That is WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Oban. Every sip of Oban is like a postcard. Oban Single Malt Scotch Whisky is offering the chance to immerse yourself in Oban and the whiskey-making process through the Oban Abode experience. 2 winners will receive a trip to Scotland to stay in the Oban Abode, just steps from the distillery. To learn more and enter, visit obanabode.obanwhiskey.com. Complete rules are available at the website. The Wadham Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the latest release in the Dewar's Smooth range of 8-year-old blended Scotch whiskies. Japanese Smooth is finished in Mizunara oak casks from Japan and joins the Caribbean Smooth, Illegal Smooth, and Portuguese Smooth whiskies in that range. It's bottled at 40% ABV. The nose is warm and welcoming with a hint of pine needles, straw, honey, and butterscotch. The taste is thick and chewy with a touch of clove, along with pine needles, butterscotch, and peach cobbler. The finish is long, complex, and well-balanced with a lingering touch of clove and a fruity sweetness. I'm scoring the Dewar's Japanese Smooth Blended Scotch a 91. The Cooney family's Bowen Distillery in Ireland's County Meath produced the Whistler PX I Love You single malt. It's finished in, you guessed it, Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has a prominent sherry influence with touches of raisins, orange peel, brown sugar, toffee, and a hint of cherries. The taste is thick and well-balanced with hints of oak, raisin bread, brown sugar, a nice maltiness, and a hint of nuts. The finish? It's long with a nice mix of dried fruits, chocolate fudge, and nuts. I'm scoring the Whistler PX I Love You Irish Single Malt a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by our friends at Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. They are reviving the tradition of Maryland-style rye whiskey at their Baltimore Farm and Waterfront Distillery. Their tequila cask-finished rye just received a gold medal in the San Francisco World Spirits Competition. It's a rye whiskey finished in extra añejo tequila barrels, displaying notes of agave and vanilla, dried fig and honey, ideal for palomas and margaritas. In-person tastings are available once again at the distillery in Baltimore. You'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. They're offering WhiskyCast listeners a free virtual guided tasting. If you buy bottles from your local retailer, a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through each one. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com and use the code WhiskyCast, all one word, to access. Please drink responsibly. I mentioned the upcoming Michter's 10-year-old single barrel rye during the news. I received a sample of this year's Michter's 10-year-old bourbon recently. It's bottled at 47.2% ABV. The nose has those classic bourbon notes of caramel, dried fruits, honey, vanilla, oak, and a hint of pipe tobacco. The taste has honey and molasses sweetness, balanced by black pepper and a hint of cinnamon, while touches of vanilla and dried fruits add complexity. The finish, long and well-balanced. I'm scoring the 2021 Michter's 10-year-old bourbon a 93. Got word this week that Wyoming Whiskey's recent auction of special bottlings of its National Parks Edition has raised more than $120,000 for the National Parks Foundation so far. The whiskey itself is a 5-year-old bourbon bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is nice and sweet with honey, caramel, straw, and subtle touches of dried fruits, along with pipe tobacco and hints of oak and leather. The taste has dark chocolate, honey, vanilla, and a hint of caramel candy, balanced by gentle spices. and the finish is long and gentle with hints of ground peppercorns, caramel, and oak. I'm scoring Wyoming Whiskey's National Parks Limited Edition a 94. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 3,200 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. Last time around in our Behind the Label segment, I noted that Breckenridge Distillery in Colorado was the highest whiskey distillery in the world at 9,600 feet above sea level. Of course, just about any time I say something is the whatever superlative in whiskeys, our quick-thinking listeners usually catch me on it. For instance, Lenny Eckstein of Deerhammer Distillery in Colorado quickly corrected me on this one. He pointed out that Snitching Lady Distillery in Fairplay, Colorado is even higher. It's located at 9,953 feet above sea level. But it turns out that that's only good enough to be the highest distillery in the U.S. and North America. Stefan Bronner passed along a link to a BolivianExpress.com article about the Andean Culture Distillery in La Paz, Bolivia. It's one of the few whiskey distilleries in South America and located in the Andes Mountains at around 11,975 feet above sea level. So, unless someone else decides to build something at a higher altitude, we're giving the guys in La Paz the title of the world's highest distillery for now. And thanks to both Lenny and Stefan for sharing those details with us. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And since we talked earlier about intoxication and why people drink whiskey and other alcoholic beverages, let's look at the combination of whiskey and one of the other most commonly used mind-altering substances, cannabis. While more and more U.S. states have been legalizing not only medicinal but recreational use of cannabis, don't expect to see any cannabis-infused whiskeys on the market anytime soon in the U.S. That's because cannabis remains illegal under federal law, and the Treasury Department's Tax and Trade Bureau will not approve any formulas or labels for alcoholic beverages that contain controlled substances. While Congress did legalize hemp cultivation in 2018, there are very strict restrictions on the use of hemp seeds, stalks, and oil in alcoholic beverages. Not only does the TTB have to sign off on a formula, but it can ask the Drug Enforcement Administration to weigh in with an opinion as well. It also defers to the Food and Drug Administration, which has not approved the use of CBD or any other cannabis derivatives in food or drinks. Now, there have been a few whiskeys over the last couple of years made with hemp seed in the mash bill that have received TTB approval, including M.B. Rowland's hemped bourbon. There have also been a couple of whiskeys from Sono 1420 Distilling in Connecticut that used 10% milled hemp seed in their mash bills, a bourbon-style and a rye-style spirit. But the TTB did not allow those whiskeys to be labeled as bourbon and rye because of the use of hemp seeds. That is not just because of hemp's connection to cannabis, though. Remember, almost every country except for India requires whiskey to be made from cereal grains like barley, wheat, and corn. While hemp seeds are edible, hemp is actually considered to be an oil seed, similar to soybeans, peanuts, and sunflowers. If there's something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, a rare style of Irish whiskey with a creative twist. A unique triple-distilled blend of single pot still and single malt premium Irish whiskies. Writer's Tears Copper Pot. Do you dare to be creative?
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, cocktail recipes, the whiskey photo of the week, and our complete archive of past episodes dating back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments at whiskycast.com.
Let's talk about our whiskey collections. Dewar's 15-year-old is a great addition, especially for those bourbon-drinking friends of yours. Priced similarly to most 12-year whiskeys, this whiskey should get an award for price alone. And if you like awards, our 15-year just took home a gold medal at this year's San Francisco World Spirit Awards. Find Dewar's 15-year-old online or at a store near you.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
People never forget the person who introduced them to Redbreast. And then those people go on to introduce others to Redbreast, and soon the flock has grown exponentially. It's like a pyramid scheme. Without any of the bad stuff, of course.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.